He didn't expect to hear anything, not in that house, not from her. But the sound stopped him in his tracks, soft, light, almost impossible. Laughter, coming from the kitchen. His pulse quickened, not with joy, but with confusion. He stepped forward, slowly, each footfall echoing down the cold marble hallway, the scent of soap and lemon in the air. And then he saw it, and for a moment he couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even make sense of what was happening, because what he was looking at made no sense at all. Charles Graham built his fortune in silence, the kind of silence that lives in boardrooms, that follows you home in sleek black cars, that looks like peace from the outside, but feels like failure behind closed doors. He lived at the top of Manhattan in a penthouse polished like a showroom, private chef, round-the-clock staff, everything under control except the only thing that mattered. Lucy, his daughter, 6 years old, non-verbal, autistic, and until that day, untouched by joy. She didn't speak, didn't look you in the eye, didn't laugh, at least not since her mother left. Charles had tried everything. Specialists from every corner of the country, devices, programs, even a therapy horse flown in from Vermont. Nothing worked. Nothing changed. Lucy stayed in her world, and Charles stayed in his. He kept his meetings. He missed her birthdays. He avoided the silence by filling it with work. Until that morning, a rainy Wednesday, he'd forgotten his laptop, came home mid-morning, didn't even tell the staff he was coming. And now he stood frozen in the doorway, staring at something he didn't know how to process. Lucy, perched on someone's shoulders, a young woman at the sink, humming while scrubbing a pot. And Lucy, laughing, freely, joyfully, her little hands flapping, eyes bright, body alive. Charles couldn't remember the last time he saw her like that. Maybe he never had, but instead of joy, what rose in him was fear, then anger, then something far worse. He opened his mouth and destroyed it all. Before we go deeper, click subscribe, tap like, and tell us where in the world you're watching from. This story is about the kind of love that doesn't always look like love at first, but finds a way when we least expect it. What happened in that kitchen wasn't the beginning of a breakdown, it was the beginning of a reckoning. And for Charles Graham, the man who had everything, it was the first time he realized what he was truly missing. He wasn't always this cold. Once Charles Graham was the kind of man who believed in legacy, in building something that mattered, not just for profit, but for family, for a future. But the day Lucy stopped speaking, something inside him stopped too. He tried to keep going, tried to be the man the world still believed he was. 40 years old, head of a tech empire that went from garage code to global IPO in 6 years. Investors called him a genius. Magazines called him a miracle. But at home, there was no press, no applause, just the quiet click of his dress shoes on hardwood floors and a daughter who couldn't say his name. Lucy had been diagnosed at 4, autism, non-verbal, sensory sensitive. Charles remembered sitting in that white office, blinking through medical terms like a man who spoke only numbers. His wife never made it to the follow-up. She packed a suitcase that fall and left a single note by the door. I can't do this. Neither could he if he was being honest. But Charles didn't leave. He stayed. Just not all the way. He handed Lucy's care to professionals, rotated through therapists like apps on his phone, hired a full-time nanny, part-time behavioral coach, private chef, and an estate manager who oversaw it all. Every corner of the penthouse was curated for ease, child-safe, ultra-modern and completely sterile, a place that looked perfect and felt like nothing. Lucy lived mostly in the East Wing. Her room, the sensory space, and the quiet kitchen where she'd often sit for hours, tapping blocks or tracing the window glass with her fingers. Charles told himself she was okay. That silence was just her version of peace. But in truth, he stopped going in there. He left before she woke, returned after she was asleep, and when he did try to connect, kneeling beside her, reaching for her hand, she'd pull away like he was a stranger. Sometimes she'd hum, just a low, fragile tone, like she was trying to find something only she could hear. It haunted him more than any silence ever could. Still, he kept moving. Because movement, at least, felt like control. He worked late, travelled often, told himself it was all for her, for Lucy's future. But the truth was quieter and heavier. He was afraid, not of her diagnosis, but of what it revealed in him, the helplessness, the failures he couldn't outrun, no matter how many millions he made. And then came that morning, the one he hadn't planned, a cancelled meeting, a forgotten laptop, the rain falling hard on the city, smearing the skyline like watercolour. He'd stepped into his home expecting silence. Instead, he heard something he hadn't heard in years. Joy. Not music. Not a therapist's song. Not a toy making noise. Laughter. Real. Messy. Alive. And for a moment, he didn't recognize it, until he followed it. Down the hallway, into the kitchen, and saw his daughter, Lucy, lifted high on the shoulders of a woman he barely remembered hiring. The new housekeeper, Grace. She was humming, bare feet on the tile, soap bubbles floating around them like tiny stars. Lucy's face was wide open, bright, wild with wonder, clapping her hands as if the world had just let her in for the first time. It should have been a miracle. But to Charles, it felt like chaos. She could fall. She could be overstimulated. She could shut down. His fear took over before his heart could catch up, and with one sentence, he tore it all apart. He didn't know it then. But that single reaction would cost him more than he ever imagined, and what would follow wasn't discipline. It was loss. Real, soul-deep, irreversible loss. He raised his voice before he could lower his fear. What the hell is going on in here? It wasn't just loud. It was sharp, like glass cutting through a moment that had no defenses. Grace froze. The sponge slipped from her hand and hit the sink with a splash. Lucy stopped laughing. Her arms dropped to her sides. Her body stiffened. The smile vanished from her face like it had never been there at all. Charles stepped forward, furious, not because she'd done something wrong, but because he didn't know what she'd done at all. His daughter was on a stranger's shoulders, a child who flinched at touch, now wrapped around this woman like she was part of her. It didn't feel safe, it didn't feel controlled, and for Charles Graham, control was survival. "Get her down, now," he snapped. Grace bent her knees slowly, lowering Lucy to the floor with careful hands. No sudden movement, no panic. But Lucy was already shrinking, her body curling inward, her fingers twitching at her sides. The look on her face wasn't confusion, it was fear. "She was safe," Grace said softly. "She asked to see the bubbles. I thought—" "You thought," he cut in, jaw tight. "You don't get paid to think." Grace stood up straight. She didn't argue, she didn't raise her voice. "I just wanted her to smile," she said. And she did. But he wasn't listening. He couldn't. He was already too far gone. "You're not her therapist, you're not her parent, you're a maid. A maid. Stay in your lane." He didn't mean to say it that way, but it came out with all the weight of everything he hadn't said in months. Grace looked at him. No tears, no defense, just a kind of quiet disbelief, like she'd seen this before, from other people, in other rooms. "Sir," she said gently, "I would never put her in danger." But Charles wasn't in the room anymore. He was in his own head, spiraling, seeing headlines, liability, lawsuits. What if she had fallen? What if she'd gotten hurt? "You're fired," he said flatly. "Sir, please, no discussion. I want you out by the hour. Marta will sort your things." Grace blinked like she hadn't heard him, but she had. Lucy let out a small sound, not quite a cry, but something close. A strained whimper, the kind she used when she was overwhelmed and couldn't process it fast enough. Grace knelt beside her. "Shh, it's okay," she whispered. "I'm right here, sweetheart, I'm not—" Charles stepped forward. "Don't touch her." Grace looked up. "She needs—" "I said, don't touch her." Her hands slowly lifted away. Lucy turned toward her, arms stretched out, needing the comfort that had just been ripped away. But Grace didn't move. She stood, nodded once, and walked out, leaving behind the sponge, the gloves, the bubbles still floating in the sink. Lucy crawled to the kitchen door, sat down, and stayed there. Charles tried to pick her up. She wriggled free. When he reached for her again, she slapped his hand and let out a shrill, broken sound he hadn't heard since she was 2. He stood still, staring at the door Grace had walked through, at the child sitting on the floor like she'd been dropped. And in that moment, he felt it. Not guilt. Not yet. Just something heavier, like the weight of a moment he wouldn't be able to take back. The house went quiet again after that, but not the same kind of quiet. This one felt heavier, like something sacred had been torn out of the air and no one knew how to name it. Lucy stayed by the kitchen door that night. She didn't eat, didn't move, just sat cross-legged on the tile, holding the wooden spoon Grace had once handed her during their first breakfast together. Marta tried coaxing her, softly, gently, offering snacks, toys, even Lucy's favorite blanket. But the girl didn't flinch. She stared at the space where Grace had stood, as if time could rewind if she just waited long enough. By morning, her blankets were gone from the bed and folded into a pile beside the pantry door. She wouldn't go back to her room, wouldn't speak, wouldn't sleep, wouldn't play, just sat. And by the second night, she began humming. But not her usual low hum. This one had a tune, a melody Grace used to sing while folding laundry. Marta stood behind the doorframe, clutching a dish towel, tears in her eyes. Charles didn't notice at first. He was already diving back into damage control, emailing HR to list a new housekeeper position, calling Lucy's therapist to reassess her schedule. He brought home a new sensory toy, left it on the table beside her. She didn't touch it. He tried kneeling again, held out his hand. But this time Lucy wouldn't even look at him. When he reached for her cheek, she turned away. She had never done that before. And suddenly, the silence wasn't peaceful. It was punishment. By the 3rd day, she stopped eating more than a few bites. Marta called the pediatrician, who said regression was common during emotional disruption, especially in children like Lucy. Just keep the routine consistent, they said. But nothing was consistent anymore. Not without Grace. And Charles was beginning to feel it, the sense that something had slipped through his fingers, something fragile and irreplaceable. He stood at the doorway that night, watching Lucy curl into herself on the floor, rocking gently, clutching that spoon like it meant something he couldn't understand. He didn't move, didn't speak, because deep down, he knew. He wasn't who she was waiting for. Marta entered quietly behind him. "Sir," she said, voice low, "I need to say something, and I know it's not my place, but I've been here too long not to speak." Charles didn't turn around. "She's getting worse," Marta continued. "You see it, I see it, and I know you don't want to hear this, but I have to tell you anyway." He looked at her, exhausted, angry, desperate for someone to blame. "You made a mistake," she said softly. Charles's jaw clenched. She was being careless. What if Lucy had fallen? She didn't. "That's not the point." "She laughed, sir," Marta interrupted gently but firmly. "For the first time in her life. I've been here since Lucy was born. I've never seen her smile like that." Charles exhaled through his nose, trying to keep control of the conversation, but Marta wasn't finished. "She wasn't just smiling," she said. "She was alive, and you took that away." Charles stepped back, shaking his head. "She's just adjusting. She'll be fine." "No, sir, she won't." Her next words dropped like stone. "She said something." Charles blinked. "What?" Marta nodded, eyes glassy. She looked at Grace and said a word. He stared at her, not breathing. She said, "Mommy." Clear as day. Time stopped. Charles looked back toward the kitchen. Lucy was still there, still rocking, still waiting. And suddenly, he couldn't feel his hands. He wanted to ask Marta to repeat it, wanted to deny it, wanted to believe she'd misheard, imagined it, wanted it too badly. But he knew Marta. She didn't lie. And the weight of that one word, "Mommy," broke something open inside him. Something that had been locked tight for far too long. He had fired the only person who'd ever reached her. Now she was gone. And Lucy was slipping away with her. He didn't sleep that night. Not after what Marta said. Not after hearing that one word echo again and again in his head. Mommy. He watched Lucy through the hallway window, curled up on the kitchen floor beneath the pantry light, her small body still rocking gently, her eyes wide and blank. And suddenly all the things he thought were final weren't. The firing, the rules, the decisions he made to stay in control. He'd been wrong. So completely, painfully wrong. And now he had to fix it. But Grace was gone. By morning, Charles had called the agency 3 times. No answer. The 4th time, a woman picked up. Polite, rehearsed, distant. "Grace Abraham," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "She worked here until 4 days ago. I need to speak with her." "I'm sorry, sir, there's no forwarding contact. No number. She didn't leave one." "What about an address?" "All we have is a P.O. box and a temporary Queen's shelter listed on her intake file. No residential information." Charles hung up without saying goodbye. Then he stood in the middle of the kitchen, staring at Lucy's untouched cereal bowl. He was a billionaire. He could buy land, move markets, track down CEOs across continents, but he couldn't find a single woman who had changed his daughter's life in less than 2 weeks. By noon, he'd called every shelter in Queens. Some were helpful. Most weren't. No one recognized the name. No one could place her face. A few volunteers promised to check the intake logs and call him back. No one did. Lucy didn't move from her spot, not even when Marta tried to carry her to bed. She cried for the first time that evening, not loudly, just a soft, hollow sobbing, like her body had forgotten how to weep properly. That night, Charles sat beside her and whispered, "I'm sorry." She didn't react. He whispered it again. Still nothing. The next morning, he hired a private investigator. He didn't ask about cost, didn't ask how long it would take. He just said the name, showed the resume from the agency file, and gave the only lead he had, the shelter. The man didn't blink, just said, "I'll find her." And then Charles waited. Each day blurred into the next. Lucy stayed curled by the door, now with her back to the world. She stopped humming, stopped crying. She simply withdrew. He tried talking. He tried toys. He tried being present. But he had shown up too late. Whatever Grace had unlocked in those short, impossible days was slipping away. And it was all his fault. On the 6th day, the investigator called. "She's not at the shelter anymore," he said. "Hasn't been for weeks, but someone remembered her. Said she used to come by with her little brother. Gave us a new lead." Charles didn't ask what it was. He was already grabbing his coat. It was raining again, the same way it had that morning in the kitchen. He arrived at a worn-down building in Queens, the kind with rusted gates and cracked steps. No elevator, 5 flights of stairs. By the 4th, he was winded. By the 5th, he was shaking. He raised his hand, knocked twice. The door creaked open. A girl, maybe 8, maybe younger, peeked out with cautious eyes. "Who are you?" I'm looking for Grace." The girl called over her shoulder. "Jew! There's a man at the door." A pause. Then footsteps. Grace appeared, towel over one shoulder, her face unreadable. The moment she saw him, something in her jaw tightened. Her arms folded across her chest. "What do you want?" Charles opened his mouth, but for once the words didn't come easily. He wasn't here as a CEO, not as a man with money, not with power, just a father who had run out of chances. "I need to talk to you," he said quietly. Grace didn't answer. She just waited, and in the silence between them stood everything he'd broken. Now he would have to face it, all of it. Grace didn't move from the doorway. She stood there, arms crossed, blocking the threshold with the quiet strength of someone who's learned the hard way what not to let back in. Charles felt the heat rise behind his collar, not from arrogance, not from anger, from shame, the kind that doesn't flinch, the kind that lingers. "I shouldn't have come unannounced," he said. Grace raised an eyebrow. "But you did." Her voice wasn't cold, just tired, like someone who'd already rehearsed this conversation and expected it wouldn't matter. Behind her, a kettle whistled on the stove. On the couch, a boy sat cross-legged, scribbling math problems in a workbook. Her world, small, cluttered, alive. He took a breath. "Lucy isn't okay." Grace didn't react. "She hasn't spoken. She's barely eating. She won't sleep unless she's by the kitchen door." Grace blinked, slow and unreadable. "You fired me." "I know. In front of your staff. Like I was nothing. I was wrong. You were cruel." He swallowed hard. "I was scared," he said. "I saw something I didn't understand, and instead of asking questions, I reacted. I thought I was protecting her." Grace leaned against the frame. "From what? Joy?" That landed. He looked down at his hands, like maybe they could explain what words couldn't. "I've never seen her like that before," he said. "Not once." Grace didn't speak, didn't nod, just watched. "She called you something," Charles said quietly. Now she looked at him. He met her eyes. "Marta told me. She called you Mommy." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of things unsaid, full of the weight of that word, spoken for the first time by a little girl who had never spoken at all. Grace's eyes welled, but she blinked them dry. "I didn't teach her that," she said. "She chose it." "I know." Charles stepped back slightly, gave her space to breathe, to decide. "I'm not here to ask you to come back the way things were," he said, "because they can't be and they shouldn't be." He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a plain white envelope and offered it to her. Grace didn't take it. "It's not money," he added. "It's a proposal, something different, on your terms, if you're willing to hear it." Still, she didn't move. He let the envelope fall onto the table just inside the door. "She needs you," he said finally. Then softer, "I need you too. Not as help, not as staff, as someone Lucy chose, as someone I failed to see." Grace looked at him for a long time. Not angry, not forgiving, just measuring, trying to decide if this man was the same one who'd thrown her out like she didn't matter, or someone new. And Charles stood in that doorway, waiting, not as a billionaire, not as a father with regrets, but as a man trying to earn back the trust he shattered. Grace finally stepped back from the door, just enough to let him see inside, not enough to invite him in. Not yet. The door didn't close, but it didn't open all the way either. What came next would be her decision, and this time he wouldn't try to control it. She let him sit at the small table by the window, not because she trusted him, but because Lucy did. The envelope stayed untouched between them, still sealed, still quiet, neither of them reaching for it. Grace poured tea for herself, didn't ask if he wanted any. Her brother glanced over from the couch, wary, but Grace gave a small nod, and he returned to his homework. Charles had never felt more out of place, which, somehow, felt right. This wasn't his home, not his terms, and for once, he didn't try to fix that. "I don't want to go back to what it was," Grace said finally. Her voice was calm, direct, not angry, but not soft either. "I don't want to be your maid, I never was. That's just the title someone put on the payroll." Charles nodded. "I understand." "No," she said. "You don't, but you will." He didn't interrupt. Grace took a slow sip of tea, then set the cup down. "I'll come back," she said, "but only under my conditions." Charles looked up. She didn't flinch. "First," she said, "I come back as Lucy's developmental caregiver. That means I decide how we work with her. I won't be cleaning baseboards or folding your suits." "Agreed," he said without hesitation. "Second, I finish my degree. Early childhood development. I was halfway through when I had to drop out. I'll cover it. Tuition, materials, everything. Third, she continued, my little brother gets transferred to a proper school, somewhere safe, somewhere that sees him for who he is, not who they assume he'll become. Charles glanced toward the boy on the couch. Quiet, focused, determined not to look back. Done, he said. He'll have options. And last, Grace leaned forward, not to intimidate but to be clear. I want respect, Charles. Not sir, not Mr. Graham. Charles. No yelling, no talking down to me, no treating me like I'm disposable when you get uncomfortable. Her voice didn't shake. She meant every word. I'm not coming back to be erased. He didn't speak for a moment. Then he nodded. Not just agreed, he said softly. Promised. Grace watched him. Really watched him. Not searching for weakness, just for truth. Then finally she leaned back. That envelope? She said. Open it when you get home. He nodded again. But he didn't reach for it. He didn't ask for a hug, didn't ask for a decision that day. He just stood quietly, and before leaving he turned toward her one last time. I was wrong about you, he said. Grace didn't smile. You weren't just wrong about me, she replied. You were wrong about your daughter. That one stung, because it was true and he knew it. He left with the envelope tucked under his arm, and 100 things heavier in his chest, and at home, waiting by the door, was a little girl still holding on to silence, and still hoping Grace would walk back through it. Grace returned on a Thursday. There was no grand arrival, no dramatic music or teary reunion, just the soft click of the front door, the quiet rustle of a bag placed gently on the floor. Lucy was sitting by the kitchen wall, exactly where she'd been for over a week. Head down, spoon clutched in her fist, eyes hollow, and then a scent, lavender and soap, a humming sound, low, familiar. Grace didn't announce herself. She simply walked past the doorway and started washing dishes, just like before. No ceremony, no instructions, just presence. At first, Lucy didn't move, didn't look. But a minute later, there was a shift, a tilt of her head, a twitch of her fingers. Then she stood, slowly, carefully, as if afraid she might wake from something that wasn't a dream. She crossed the floor with quiet steps and reached for Grace's apron. Grace didn't turn. She just kept humming. Then Lucy pressed her forehead gently against Grace's back and let out a sound. A single broken syllable that cracked the quiet like morning light. Mommy. Grace closed her eyes. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just kept washing. That night, Lucy slept in her own bed for the first time in 12 days. In the weeks that followed, everything began to shift. Not dramatically, not quickly, just one breath at a time. Lucy laughed again, quietly at first, like she wasn't sure if it was allowed, then louder, full, alive. She let Grace comb her hair, let Charles sit beside her without pulling away, started clapping to music, dancing in circles, grabbing Grace's hands and spinning until they both fell over laughing on the rug. And then the words came, not in full sentences, not even every day, but real. Bubbles. Juice. Mommy. Dog. Charles listened to each one like it was a verse from scripture. He started coming home early, not for meetings, not for show, just to watch them. Sometimes he stayed in the doorway, didn't say a word, just stood there, watching his daughter come back to life. One afternoon he heard Lucy whisper something from across the room. She was lying on her back, her head on Grace's lap. Her voice was faint, like a secret. Mommy loves me. Charles had to leave the room. He didn't want them to see him cry. He wasn't sure when it happened, but something in him had changed. The boardroom didn't feel as urgent. The company no longer filled the void, and the silence he once drowned in was now full of music. Grace hadn't just returned to care for Lucy. She had redefined what care looked like: firm, gentle, intentional. There were charts on the fridge now, routine cards on the wall, flashcards by the sink, labelled with tiny drawings and stickers. And Lucy? She pointed at them, said the words when she could, and smiled when she couldn't. The girl who once lived in shadows was beginning to reach for the light. But love, Charles was learning, wasn't a single moment of redemption. It was 100 quiet ones, strung together by someone who refused to walk away. It started with a simple request. Grace had asked for a team meeting. Nothing formal, just a check-in with the household staff. They gathered in the living room. Marta, the chef, the driver, 2 assistants, even the security chief. Everyone was seated, except Charles. He stood by the window, hands clasped tightly behind his back. The moment didn't ask for luxury. It asked for something far harder. Humility. Grace stood beside the fireplace, shoulders relaxed, expression calm. Not demanding, not performative, just present. Charles turned slowly, faced the room, cleared his throat once, and then he spoke. 2 weeks ago, I made a mistake, he said, not just as a father, but as a man. The room fell still. I reacted from fear, not understanding. I let my pride speak louder than compassion, and I disrespected someone who gave my daughter more than I ever have. He looked at Grace, not with shame, with reverence. You brought Lucy back to life, he said, his voice tight. Not with therapy, not with money, but with patience, with warmth, with presence. The silence in the room thickened. I treated you like staff, like help, like someone who could be replaced. A pause. You can't be. Grace didn't look away, didn't flinch. She let him say what needed to be said. I'm sorry, Charles said. Not because I feel guilty, but because I was blind. He took a slow breath, then did something no one expected. He lowered himself to one knee. Not out of drama, but truth. A billionaire in a $1,000 suit, kneeling before the woman he once fired without thought. I'm asking for forgiveness, not for what I did, because I can't undo it, but for what I'll do differently from here on out. Grace looked down at him. Her eyes didn't soften, but they did shine, with something quiet, something real. She nodded. Apology accepted, she said. Then gently, let's move forward, not pretend it never happened. The staff exhaled like they'd all been holding something in. Marta wiped her eyes. The chef gave a quiet nod. Even the driver shifted in his seat, because they weren't just witnessing an apology, they were watching a man transform. That evening, Charles sat at the edge of Lucy's bed. Grace was reading beside her, voice soft, rhythmic. Lucy curled between them, her head resting on Grace's arm, her fingers gently tracing the fabric of Charles's sleeve. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel like an outsider in his own home. He felt part of something, not because he deserved it, but because he chose to show up for it. Forgiveness wasn't a finish line, it was a door. And now that it was open, all that mattered was what came next. 2 years later, Grace stood at a podium in a deep blue cap and gown. The tassels swayed as she looked down at the degree in her hands, Bachelor of Science in Early Childhood Development, magna cum laude. She didn't cry, but Charles did. He sat in the front row beside Lucy, who clapped wildly as Grace's name was called. Lucy didn't need prompts anymore. She knew when to clap, she knew who she was clapping for. Life had changed, slowly, then all at once. Charles stepped down from his company's board the year Grace went back to school. Not because he had to, because he finally understood what he didn't want to miss. He poured his energy and his guilt into something new. The Lucy Foundation, a non-profit dedicated to supporting underprivileged neurodiverse children and training caregivers in Grace's development model. No tech, no stock charts, just people helping people. The first center opened in the Bronx. By year's end, there were 3 more. Lucy still didn't talk much, but she didn't have to. She laughed. She danced. She reached for people when she wanted them near. And she used her words, not many, but enough. Enough to tell the world she was in it now. That spring, the foundation hosted its first gala. Donors, families, teachers, staff. And on stage, Under a warm halo of lights stood an 8-year-old girl in a navy dress with silver shoes. She held a mic in both hands. Her eyes searched the crowd until they landed on 2 people, one on her left, one on her right. She smiled. "I have 2 parents," she said, her voice soft but steady. "One made me—" She turned to Charles and squeezed his hand. "And one found me." She turned to Grace, who was already in tears. The room fell silent. And then came the applause, louder than music, fuller than speeches. Charles didn't say a word that night. He didn't need to. Sometimes love wasn't something you said. It was something you learned how to show. Later that week, they visited a small garden just outside the new Queen's Centre. Charles pushed the gate open, while Grace walked with Lucy and her little brother Noah. The kids ran ahead, dirt under their nails, joy under their feet. Lucy paused at a small patch of soft soil. She crouched down, dug gently, and pulled a young rosebush from the canvas bag she'd carried. "Why a rose?" Grace asked softly. Lucy shrugged, then looked up at her, eyes steady, voice small but clear. "This one's for Mommy." Grace smiled, touched her chest. "For me?" Lucy nodded, then reached into the bag again and pulled out a second rose. "And this one's for second chances." Charles knelt beside her, gently helping guide her hands. The wind stirred through the leaves. Not loud, just enough to carry the sound of healing, enough to let something new take root. Not every story ends where it began. Some end in gardens, where silence becomes laughter, and love grows exactly where it was never supposed to.